Welcome back for part 2 of the 1999 Acura RL timing belt and water pump replacement. Alright, so before we start replacing parts and put the front of the engine back together, let's talk about some options for acquiring parts to get this job done. For reference, here are the parts I found on one of the discount Acura sites in the orange column versus what I paid in the yellow column. By the way, I'll include all the part numbers in the video's description. I planned about a year ago to do this job this summer, and I knew the most expensive part to acquire is the OEM Honda water pump at almost $300 just about everywhere I looked. I saw several kits available, including one from Gates. My preference for the major components was OEM Honda, so I set up a search on eBay and just let it marinate. Finally, a few weeks later, I got a hit and purchased a Honda water pump in sealed packaging for $120. Other parts in the Honda timing belt and water pump kit are made for Honda by various manufacturers, so I did some research and cross-referencing. So we can quickly get back to the task at hand. I'll put some information in the description below that you can read at your leisure. We're going to start with the water pump, so the first thing to replace is the thermostat housing gasket. So you probably can't see a thing that I'm doing, so I'm just going to go ahead and put this in. Again, goes in this orientation. Here's the new one. This is a Felpro 35828. The OEM part number, actually this one's made in Japan by the way too. The OEM part number is 19313 P5G000. Okay, it looks like that is in. So there's that. I think I'm going to put a little bit of silicone, a 3M silicone paste on there just so I can slide the water pump on there and not have this get snagged and come out. Alright, so on the back of the water pump there are these dowel pins, and one of them was stuck in here. So I just grabbed a drill bit. I saw this trick before. One as close in size as possible. Put that in there, and that just kind of pried it out. This one's a little too small, so I don't have an intermediate size. I have one that's too small, then one that's too big. So you could wrap some tape around here and try it that way. There we go. So definitely don't lose these. Okay, so I'm going to put the water pump in. There's a gasket on the back. Silicone paste already on here on the other gasket. So make sure your water pump has a gasket. I would stick with the OEM water pumps myself. Dowel pin is in here, right there. I have one on this side also, right there in that slot. So I need to make sure those all match up. Okay. There we go. That one's in, and this one's in. Alright, so we've got the water pump pretty much in place right now. We just have to put all the bolts in. Other water pump comes in handy. So this is the old one. I took all the bolts from the new one. Remember when I took the bolts out of this one, I put them in that one. So now that I'm putting that one on, I put all the bolts in this one. So I know exactly where they go. So since you really can't see much, I'm just going to go ahead and put the bolts in. And if there's a stopping point where I want to point out something, I'll just do that. Okay, so the one water pump bolt right over here, that is a pain to get back in. So I'm using an offset wrench, 12 millimeter, and I'm using it in this orientation here instead of like that. Okay, we're going to take a look at the crankshaft seal, which is right behind these two gears here. So I'm going to pull these off. Just slide them off the crankshaft. This little plate here. Notice this plate, that's the back side of it. Alright, and to get the crankshaft gear off, we're going to take this key out of here. So this little beveled part in the back and the front, those go down. So don't lose this key. This is definitely an important thing you do not want to lose. Alright, so I'm going to slide the crank gear off here. Like this way. I don't see much in the way of oil on the back side of this, so that's a good sign. Yeah, it looks pretty clean. So we can change this now if we want to. Not something we have to do, but while we're in here, we may want to do that. Because we don't want to be back in here later and have to tear the whole thing apart and do that later. To get the crankshaft seal out, I experimented until I came up with something that worked. So I won't bore you with that experimentation. Basically, I started by cleaning the seal's face with all-purpose cleaner to remove any oil. I use a low-speed drill to drill 1/16 inch pilot holes through the rectangles at about the 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock positions. As you'll see, I ended up only using the 9 o'clock hole to remove the seal. The crank seal is reinforced with metal, so it took a little while to pierce it. I took it very slowly and immediately stopped after I broke through. I then enlarged the hole with the 7/64 drill bit. Alright, so I'm going to attempt to take this out. What I've done is I've got looks like a 3.5 inch, I think it's 3.5 inch screw. And I've screwed it in the hole that I made all the way as far as it'll go. And 4 inches or 4.5 probably would be ideal. Take a shim, put it on the end of the crankshaft. And I have a pry bar here. There we go. And it's out. So a little bit of trial and error, but that seemed to work pretty well. All right, so I'm going to put the new seal in. Part number is 91212PY3003. There it is. And it's got a little bit of, looks like some sort of silicone or something on the interior. I'm going to add a little bit on the outside too. 3M silicone paste. Remember, the flat side faces out. Slide that on here. Now, there is a tool that you use to put this in. I don't have that tool, so I'm trying the best that I can here with what I got. So I've got a little ABS pipe. This is 2 inches. Gonna hit it with the side of the hammer. Pretty good. Tap it a couple more times. Just nice and square on here. All right. I think that's good. You guys tell me what you think. But I think we got it in there. All right, so let's put our crank gears back in. So I'm going to start with this one. Make sure the slot here is facing up. Flat side of this up against the crankshaft. There we go. So this goes on next. This is the back side. That's the dirty side. So it sits like this. So if you've got a gap between this and the gear, that means you've got it on the wrong way. Okay, let's put our key in next. So beveled side down. You see that? Back in the slot right there. And then our other gear. Now on this one, the flat side goes out. Like so. Okay, so I'm going to be replacing the tensioners here for the timing belt and for the balancer belt. Now I do this religiously every time I change the timing belt and water pump. So, the interval is what, 105,000 miles or every 7 years. So you might as well save yourself the headache of having your timing belt snap and just do that now. So I am going to take this one out. Start with this one. This is loose right now. This is a 12 millimeter. And pull it out. And there it is. So the one thing I wanted to point out is this peg here. Make sure that when you put your tensioner back in, that this part here goes right on that peg. That's a very important step to make sure it's tensioned correctly. Alright, so I'm going to put the new one in. Now on this bolt there is a washer, so make sure you don't lose that. Right there. Like so. And then put the bolt in my second hand here. Okay, I'm going to put the spring on, hook on the end of the tensioner. There it is, right there, on the end of the tensioner. Then we're going to grab the other end and hook it right on here on the water pump. Okay, so I got it right there. I'm just going to hook it up here. Right there. Okay, we're going to take the balancer belt tensioner off next, which is right here. Start by taking the spring off right here. That bolt down there is a 14 millimeter. It's loose right now, so I'll just take it out. This one also has a washer, so don't lose that. There it is. There's our tensioner right here. And it has that little, same kind of thing as the other one. There's a little peg. Actually, it is, I'll take a picture of it and show you. Okay, it's on the peg. I've got it in hand tight right now. This is how our spring looks. Right there, that's how it was hooked on. So grab it close to the coils, like that, and then just bring it over. There we go. Alright, so we're going to remove the spark plugs. That's going to make it easier for us to turn the timing belt later on when we have to check it. So I'm going to take all three of these coil packs out. Okay, and 8 millimeters once again. Alright, so I have a magnetic spark plug socket. This is 5/8. I've talked about using these before. I like using these magnetic spark plug sockets. Prevents you from dropping a spark plug. There it is. Okay, so I'm going to put the coil packs in to prevent anything from falling in the holes. Alright, so we're going to move to the other side now. Alright, so I'm going to pull this gear off here. And this plate. Because we're on to putting the timing belt on next. Alright, so here is the new belt. I transferred the marks from the old belt. One thing I discovered is that there are 66 timing belt teeth between the right cam pulley mark in red and the left cam pulley mark in blue. There are also 66 teeth between the left cam pulley mark in blue and the mark I made 4 teeth counterclockwise of the metal key on the crankshaft, which is denoted in orange. Then there are 65 teeth between the crank mark in orange and the right cam pulley mark in red. So this may help you out if you're ever unsure. Alright, so I'm not sure how well you're going to be able to see what I'm doing here, but I figured I'd just go ahead and film what I could. So, what we're going to do first of all is we're going to route the timing belt. You have this mark up here. That's kind of my first point of reference. Left pulley mark right there. Drop this down in there. I'm just going to set this up on that mark. Okay. And a trick I learned on the Acura Legend forum, I'm just going to put a little clip on there just to keep that in place for a second here. Actually, let me move it over so I can see my mark. Alright, so I'm down here by the crank pulley now. I've done the left cam pulley already. So that's right on our mark right there for our crankshaft. And we are going to route this now. That's going to go over our tensioner. We've got to go around the water pump also. You're not going to be able to see any of that. But going underneath the water pump here. This is what we are left with. I'm going to try to at least get it over, all the way over here. Make sure it's still down there on our mark on the crankshaft. Alright. And that looks good down there. Alright, so sorry I couldn't get you a little better view of all the routing I'm doing here, but we are just about ready to put this over here on the cam pulley on the right side. Alright, so I always find it best to take the spring off here, and then this tensioner will slide over that way with this loose. It's slightly loose, it's not totally loose here. So that's what I would do. I would take the spring off that peg up there temporarily. We'll put it back on after we get the belt on over here. Alright, so let's get the belt on this pulley here. You can see the R looks like it's pretty close to this mark, so that's good. So what I've done in the past is turn this half a tooth to the right. You have to be very careful that you don't turn it too far and that this whole thing doesn't jump. So I'm going to advance this just half a tooth. That's good right there. I'm not going to move it any further than that. Takes a little bit of coaxing to get it on, so just be patient. Okay, looks like our R is lined up right there, as you can see. Well, that is a pain in the butt to get this on here. Definitely advance it half a tooth. Be very careful when you advance it. Don't put too much force on that or you're going to jump the whole thing and you have to try to bring it back. So there's the cam pulley advanced half a tooth. Alright, so I'm going to put the spring back on that peg. There we go. 2 hands necessary. So it looks like we are set to tighten this tensioner up. So we'll do that next. And I'm going to remove the binder clip from here, so don't forget that. Alright, so I'm going to loosen the tensioner. Then we're going to tighten it up to 31 foot-pounds, so 12 millimeters. That's pretty loose already. .31 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to rotate the crankshaft 5 or 6 turns to properly seat the belt. The camshaft and crankshaft gear marks need to be lined up so the number 1 piston is at top dead center after we're done rotating the crankshaft. So I've reinstalled the lower cover with just a few bolts to hold it in place. I've reinstalled the crank pulley with this bolt. We'll use a 19mm socket on a long handle ratchet to turn the crankshaft. Alright, so we've got our mark on the left cam pulley lined up again after our 6 rotations. And there is our red mark on the right cam pulley. You can see that's right on there. A little off on your perspective here. Looks like our white mark down there is lined up with that pointer right here in the center. So again, your perspective is a little bit off. I can see that it's right on. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is rotate the crankshaft, and that equates to 10 teeth on the camshaft pulley. And we should see that arrow, this arrow right here. There should be a blue mark back here that lines right up with that. It's almost right there. All right. About right there. So hopefully you can see that there's a faint blue mark on the crankshaft pulley. It's lining up with the arrow in the center. And now what we need to do is loosen the tensioner again. Loosen that up and then tighten it back up, and that'll set our tension on the belt. I used a 12mm socket with an extension to loosen the adjuster's bolt 180 degrees. Then I tighten it to 31 foot-pounds. Since the pulley bolt tightened some when we turned the crankshaft, I'm giving it a quick yank with the breaker bar to loosen and remove it. The crankshaft pulley can be turned by hand if the timing is now slightly off. Once the timing is reset, the crank pulley and lower cover need to be removed so we can proceed. Don't forget to tighten the camshaft bolts with the 12mm to 23 foot-pounds. Alright, so I've got the lower cover off, and I'm just checking the tension on the belt after I did the adjustment procedure. You can see here, that's much better than when we first put the belt on. It was really loose. That looks really good. Okay, so we're going to replace the balancer belt next. And before we begin, the balancer gear's nub and the arrow on the housing need to line up. Alright, so I'm going to attempt to take you in there to show you the sealing bolt for the balancer shaft. You can kind of see it here, hopefully. It's right there. It's got red on it. It's right behind the engine mount. So come back out. And I'll go back in. Here's a shot from this side. It's right behind the power steering pump there, over to the right. One thing I did here, disconnected the oxygen sensor. I also took off this breather tube for the differential. Took it off this bracket. Just remember to put it back on if you do that. Just going to move it to the side a little bit. Looks like our 12mm is accessible. It's a little bit weird down there. It's kind of hard to get to it. So we can either try to go over the top like this, which I don't know if that's going to work or not. This thing's floppy too, so it's not the best thing to use, I would say. Okay, we'll just crack it loose. So I'm just going to spin it out by hand. There it is right there. I'm going to put a bolt in there. This is an M6 bolt. It should be at least 45mm long. This one's 50mm. I think a screwdriver would also work if you can get one in there, one that's short enough. So find the hole here. There it is. Doesn't actually thread in, it just goes in and acts as a stop for the shaft. Try to get that all the way in if you can. We need to line up the timing again, and it's not advisable to rotate the engine counterclockwise after the timing belt adjustment, so I've reinstalled the crank pulley. You can decide at this point if you want to reinstall the pulley bolt or just turn the crankshaft by hand. We've got our balancer gear on there. Keep turning it until it slots in there. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to take this off. Alright, so it looks like the dot back there, hopefully you can see that. The dot on that gear is lined up with the arrow, so it looks like our engine's at top dead center on the #1 piston. Alright, so I'm going to put the balancer belt on, and just like with the timing belt, you could elect to take the spring off. Let's pull it off of here. That allows that to drop down. Put this on here, this way. Let's try that, go it this way and then back this way. Like so. Just going to hook it back on there. Okay, and that one you can actually pull by hand. Alright, so I'm going to tighten the bolt down there. This one right here, 14 millimeters, 33 foot-pounds. Alright, so we're going to take this 6 millimeter out of here. And we're going to put our sealing bolt back in. We're going to install the sealing bolt with an M12 aluminum crush washer just like the original. Flat side against the head of the bolt here. Perfect. Alright, so getting a torque wrench in this area is really difficult. So I'm just going to use an offset wrench and tighten it down. Torque spec is 14 foot-pounds and it's 12 millimeter. I think that's good. Alright, so we need to put the crank pulley back on yet again. And what we're going to do is we're going to rotate the engine 5 or 6 times back to top dead center. The purpose of doing this is to make sure that our balancer belt is seated correctly. Alright, looks like we're just about back to top dead center here. We'll finish rotating this thing. Alright, looks like our marks are lined up again. And the crank mark looks pretty good. So now we need to rotate the crankshaft 1 turn. Okay, so I'm going to loosen this tensioner bolt 180 degrees, 14 millimeters. That's good. Then we're going to tighten it back up to 33 foot-pounds. Again, 14 millimeters. Now that the timing and balancer belts are installed and adjusted, we don't have to worry about timing from here on out. So I removed the crank pulley and reinstalled the lower cover off camera. We'll pick up from there. Alright, so we're going to work on the upper timing covers now. So make sure the gasket for the lower cover is seated correctly. Make sure it's in the groove. And also the other thing I did on this side, I remember, is right here is a little clip. So you want to push it that way or pull it that way, and then lift this up a little bit to give yourself a little bit of space here. And underneath the water hose there, and slide it down and seat it in there. We'll get our bolts started. This one up here first. Alright, so let me put this one in up here. Got a socket. Trying to keep this from falling out. Okay. And then that last bolt, I'm just going to do it off camera. That's the one that's between the arch of the alternator. So you have to get right in there and then tighten that down. So I'm just going to tighten them down. I think the torque spec, I believe, is 9 foot-pounds on all these, but I usually just cinch it down and call it good. And we'll do the passenger side cover now. So I'm not cleaning all this stuff up. I'll probably clean the engine at some point later on. I just want to get this back together. There we go. Got those two started. Alright, so I'm just going to finish this off and we'll move on. There are 3 bolts left for the lower cover. So this one goes right here. I'm going to put that in now. 10 millimeters. And then the other 2, that go on, I think they go on this bracket here. They go right through here, this one here, and then there's another one right there. I'm going to put those on after I get the crank pulley tightened. I want to make sure the tightening of the crank pulley bolt goes flawlessly before I put everything else back on. So there it is. That's where the key goes. There we go. Here's our crank pulley bolt. Now you're supposed to oil the threads. I just took a little bit of bearing grease and put it on the threads here. Make sure this is clean. So you want no oil on this part. Put that back in. Okay. It's about hand tight now. Okay, so the crank pulley tool is going to go on this side this time. It's going to go on the driver's side up against the subframe. Now, we want it to, when we attempt to tighten this, that this has some resistance. So in other words, if it goes back this way, then you know that you don't have your ratchet set correctly. So arms in tight. Oh, okay. Guess we're already there. There we go. And pull that off. There it is. Alright, so we are on the home stretch here. I am going to put everything back on. Some things may be a little out of order of what we took it off, but I think you can kind of figure it out from here though. So the first thing I'm going to do is put this back on, this bracket. Now the clip that was on here before, I think the clip was for this hose, that broke. So that's going to happen every once in a while. You're going to break a clip because a lot of these plastic parts are really old. So I probably will just go to the salvage yard and find a few things, but I think I broke like one clip, and I also have to find this part also. Those two bolts are these long ones for the lower cover. So I got the lower hose in right there. The hose back off of this bracket temporarily, I think. Alright, so I'm going to put the harness holder bolts in so you can see where they go. I don't think it matters whether we put this in first or put the harness holder bolts in first. You can see it. It goes through here and through here. Okay, that's tight. Alright, so let's put this large bracket back on. Both bolts are 10 millimeters. Start that one, I'll start the other one. Make sure everything's lined up first. We are going to put the oxygen sensor back in its bracket right there on the valve cover. This goes back on here. So this is the clip that I took out so I could get to this one bolt down there. Let's put it back through here. It should snap in. That's in. Put this back in. Take this bolt out. Okay, so again, in no particular order, I'm going to put the hoses back on over here. This one with the white mark on it, right there, that goes here. On the leftmost pipe. I'll take a picture of this too. This one has that, some sort of resonator or something on it. That goes up here. And then this curved one goes back here. Like that. Okay, so we've got 3 vacuum hoses here. Okay, I'm going to put this connector back on. This is the one that I have to replace, but I'm going to put it back on here. Should stay on just fine. And then our breather hose Goes back on there. Okay, so I'm going to put the TCS back on. And this bolt, or this clamp bolt right there, should be up. And the two arrows right here, one arrow there, one arrow here, they line up. Okay, so we've got a bunch of connectors. Got one here, it goes back on here. And one up here. Alright, so before you put the rest of the components in this area in, I would advise putting the power steering belt back on, putting the AC belt back on, and then putting the alternator belt back on, making sure those are adjusted correctly. So we're going to pretend like those belts are already on and just move forward. But I'll put links to those videos, you can check them out. Okay, so I'm inserting this part in the video. I forgot to put this bar back on. So these are 12 millimeters, and I'm going to put the bottom bolt in first. Okay, and the torque spec is 16 foot-pounds, 12 millimeters. Okay, so this goes in next. I'll fix that in a second. 10 millimeters. Alright, then this hose goes back on. Alright, let's put this hose back on. Straighten it out. There we go. Alright, let's put our air box back in. Get these bolts out first. Two arrows lining up. Alright, so what we're going to do now is go ahead and put our spark plugs back in. Again, I like to use a magnetic spark plug socket just so it keeps the spark plug from falling. Okay. Coil packs in. We'll put our connectors back on. Make sure it snaps on. Okay, I'm going to put the strut brace back in. Okay. Put all the bolts back in and nuts. Okay, 16 foot-pounds, 12 millimeters. Before reinstalling the engine cover, refill and bleed the coolant if you'll be using the bleed screw. Check out the video on coolant replacement if you're unsure. Alright, so I'm going to put the engine cover back on. There we go. Okay, and the bolts in the front go in first, and then everything up top goes in left after that. And everything is 10 millimeters, by the way. So when you start your car, if you notice any loud or strange noises, turn it off right away and recheck everything. Alright, so there you have it. There's replacing the timing belt and water pump on the 1999 Acura RL. We also did a few associated items to get this job done. So if you've never done the timing belt and water pump on any car at all, make sure you give yourself at least a couple days to get this done. And maybe have a second pair of eyes even to watch over and make sure you're doing things correctly. You want to make sure you have a rhyme and a reason for everything you're doing when it comes to timing. The timing has to be set correctly before you take the belt off, and it has to be reconfirmed when you put the belt back on. So hopefully this information was helpful, and thanks for watching.